The Young and the Restless spoilers. The holiday season in Genoa City had always been a mixture of glamour, nostalgia, and carefully controlled chaos, but this year carried an undercurrent of something far darker than the usual scandals, romantic disasters, or corporate feuds. There was tension in the air, a sense that the winter festivities were about to be overshadowed by a storyline that would rip through one of Genoa City's most stable families. Bryton James, in a recent interview, had hinted at a dramatic upcoming twist for Devon Winters and Abby Newman Abbott Winters, two characters who had lived in an almost suspicious bubble of domestic bliss since their marriage. They had settled into a routine built on raising Dominic, managing their careers, and avoiding the constant storms that seemed to follow every other couple in town. But stability had an expiration date on a soap opera, and Devon's brief but powerful interview revealed that the storm heading toward them would be the kind that didn't just rattle their marriage, it would threaten to shatter it entirely. For months, viewers had noticed the growing distance between Devon and the rest of the drama-heavy Newman and Abbott circles. Devon had been written as the voice of reason, appearing only to scold Kane Ashby for his latest foolishness or caution Nate Hastings about his questionable decisions. Meanwhile, Abby had been mostly absent, floating at the edges of Genoa City's chaos with a contented glow that seemed almost suspiciously serene. But Bryton's comments made something clear: this quiet chapter was merely the calm before a devastating twist. A twist rooted in danger, fear, and the one thing that could shake Devon more violently than any corporate betrayal or romantic heartbreak: the threat of harm to his family. And when James hinted that someone in Devon's family would be in danger, fans knew immediately that the stakes were about to rise to a level Genoa City hadn't seen in years. It didn't take much imagination to connect the dots. Dominic, the child Devon shared with Abby through one of the most emotionally complex surrogacy stories the show had ever produced, was the perfect target for a Christmas kidnapping storyline. Not because of shock value alone, but because Dominic represented something sacred to Devon, something fragile, innocent, and irreplaceable. Devon had lost too many people in his life already: Drusilla, Hillary, Neil, Hillary again through flashbacks and trauma. Every defining point of heartbreak in Devon's life had been connected to loss or the fear of it. The idea that someone might abduct Dominic during the holidays, a season meant for joy, felt like exactly the kind of psychological gut punch the writers might inflict to realign Devon's storyline and pull him back into the emotional center of Genoa City. But Dominic wasn't the only possible victim. Tucker McCall, Amanda Sinclair, Lily Winters, even Moses? All circled around Devon's orbit in ways that could spark dangerous consequences. And yet none of them would devastate Devon the way losing Dominic would. Abby's connection to the Newman empire also made their son a potential target. Victor Newman had accumulated enemies for decades, and even though he always vowed to shield his family, the sins of his past often seeped into the present. Kidnapping had long been part of the Newman legacy curse. Adam had been kidnapped as a child. Faith. Mariah. Even baby Christian had disappeared at one point. Abby herself had survived stalkers, manipulations, and threats from obsessive figures tied to her mother and father. The pattern was clear: Newman children were rarely safe for long. And with rumors of a dark storyline, Dominic's vulnerability loomed over everything Devon and Abby had built. But what made the impending kidnapping even more compelling was the emotional domino effect it would set off. Devon was a man of control. Measured, thoughtful, protective to the point of rigidity. He had always prided himself on being the steady center of his fractured family. But losing Dominic, or even the threat of losing him, could unravel Devon in ways the audience had not yet seen. It would awaken every trauma embedded in his memory, every insecurity buried beneath the facade of strength he carried. It would push him into panic, into rage, into desperation. And desperation made Devon dangerous. Especially when paired with Abby's mounting guilt and the possibility that someone from her past, someone connected to Chance, Victor, or even Tucker, could be responsible for the abduction. Bryton's comments about trouble in the marriage pointed to something deeper than fear alone. The kidnapping, or near kidnapping, or even the credible threat of one, could expose fractures between Devon and Abby that had been quietly forming but never confronted. Abby's chaotic romantic history? Chance's disappearance, her own emotional instability, the custody triangle that once nearly destroyed her, could fuel conflict. Devon, meanwhile, had never fully processed the trauma of losing Hillary or the burden of suddenly becoming a father under unconventional circumstances. Their marriage had been built on a foundation of friendship and shared love for Dominic, not on the kind of emotional intimacy that survives devastation. And now, devastation was coming. The kidnapping storyline. If it landed on Dominic, would not simply be a plot twist. It would highlight everything Devon feared, everything Abby avoided, and everything simmering beneath the surface of their quiet domestic life. For the first time, Devon might find himself questioning Abby's instincts, her judgment, or even her ability to protect their son. Abby might spiral into guilt, self-blame, and the desperate fear of losing both her son and her marriage. And in the middle of the chaos, the identity of the kidnapper would become a puzzle that tied together multiple storylines: Kane's growing instability, Tucker's unresolved connection to Devon, Victor's endless list of enemies, even Audra's questionable alliances. The writers could easily weave a kidnapping into the broader canvas of Genoa City's most dangerous antagonists, making the reveal not just shocking, but deeply personal. There was also the chilling possibility that the kidnapping had nothing to do with corporate rivalry or family vendettas. It could be tied to something far more emotional, someone who knew the family, someone who felt owed something, someone who believed Dominic belonged to them. Abby's surrogacy story had been rife with emotional landmines. Mariah's forced kidnapping while carrying Dominic. Stitch's psychotic obsession. Chance's lingering trauma. Even Amanda's earlier involvement in the custody battle. Any one of these connections could re-emerge, snapping violently into the present and leaving Devon and Abby scrambling for control. And in the worst-case scenario, the kidnapper could be someone Devon trusted, a twist that would hit with devastating emotional force. The heart of the storyline, however, would be Devon himself. A man who had always fought hard for stability, for family, for something permanent in a world where everything else seemed temporary. If Dominic were taken or threatened, Bryton James' promise of an explosive storyline would come to life. Devon would stop at nothing to bring his son home. He would turn on allies. He would confront enemies. He would blame Abby. He would blame himself. He would unleash parts of himself he had buried long ago. And in doing so, he would reshape not just his storyline, but the fabric of Genoa City's holiday narrative. In the end, the question was not simply who will be kidnapped. It was who will Devon become when the person he loves most is in danger. And the answer promised to be darker, more emotional, and more transformative than anyone expected. The approaching winter in Genoa City carried a tension that felt heavier and more foreboding than anything the residents had felt in years. A kind of emotional pressure that hinted not just at heartbreak or betrayal but at the possibility of a truly devastating crime, one that would fracture families, ignite old rivalries, and drag several long-ignored characters back into the center of the storm. Bryton James' interview had already teased the idea that danger was coming for someone in Devon Winter's family, but the deeper soap opera whispers suggested something even more explosive. The kidnapping that fans had been speculating about for months might finally erupt, with more than one potential victim and multiple emotionally charged motives swirling around the Winters, Newman, Copeland, and Chancellor families. And what made the storyline even more intriguing was how many other false spoilers, still unresolved, seemed to converge perfectly into this one catastrophic event. The triangle between Mariah Copeland, Tessa Porter, and Daniel Romalotti Jr. had been simmering with quiet angst ever since Tessa left town on tour, leaving Mariah emotionally unstable and increasingly insecure. But the moment Mariah returned from treatment, still fragile, still struggling with her compulsions, everything seemed to snap inside her. Jealousy, attachment trauma, and an overwhelming fear of abandonment had shaped Mariah for years, but now those emotions were transforming into something darker. She had already lashed out at Will Hensley, grabbing him by the throat in a moment of uncontrolled panic that hinted at how volatile she had become. And if Mariah was willing to physically attack someone over emotional overwhelm, what would stop her from spiraling into something even more dangerous once she was back in the chaotic, pressure-filled environment of Genoa City, surrounded by triggers she hadn't fully addressed? This was where the speculation surrounding Dominic Newman Abbott Winter's chancellor became even more chilling. Dominic was the emotional heart of two families, the Winters and the Newmans, and the living embodiment of one of Y&R's most complicated surrogacy stories. Mariah had once been kidnapped while pregnant with him, trapped, traumatized, and forced into a psychological bond with the child she carried. The scars of that experience had never truly healed. And now, with her mental state unstable again, and with the emotional triangle between her, Tessa, and Daniel spiraling out of control, Dominic became an all too plausible target. Not out of malice, but out of trauma. Out of obsession. Out of a desperate need to cling to something that felt like purpose when the rest of her world was collapsing. Mariah's love for Dominic had always been complicated, nurturing yet overly attached, soft yet psychologically fraught. The idea of her kidnapping him again wasn't just possible, it was the kind of full-circle tragedy the writers loved to use to bring a story to its most emotional peak. But Dominic wasn't the only candidate for abduction. Crystal Khalil's upcoming maternity leave meant Lily Winters was poised for a storyline that would remove her from the canvas temporarily, and the writers had two options: send Lily away peacefully or tie her exit to a shocking event that would ripple across Genoa City. And the truth was simple, a peaceful exit wouldn't push the story forward. A kidnapping, however, especially with all the chaos surrounding Kane Ashby, Phyllis Summers, and the stolen AI program, would explode into a multi-family crisis capable of fueling drama for months. Lily becoming the kidnapped victim made perfect narrative sense. She was connected to Kane, who was spiraling into revenge. She was connected to Devon, whose world was already being set up for emotional devastation. And she was connected to the larger Winters and Chancellor legacy, making her disappearance a massive, story-defining event. Thematically, Lily's abduction would force Devon to confront the very thing he feared most, losing another person he loved. And it would thrust Kane into a guilt-soaked tailspin if his actions, manipulations, and schemes had indirectly triggered the chain of events leading to Lily's disappearance. Lily being kidnapped wouldn't just remove her from the show temporarily, it would destabilize everyone around her. Devon, already on edge, would unravel. Wright and James had made it clear that trouble was coming for Devon and Abby's marriage, and Lily's disappearance would be the perfect detonator. Devon would become frantic, paranoid, suspicious in ways that dredged up the worst moments of his past: the loss of Hillary, the death of Neil, the trauma of watching people he loved disappear or die without warning. He would begin to lash out at Abby, accusing her of being too trusting, too distracted, too wrapped up in her loyalty to her father. And that was where Victor Newman entered the storyline again. Victor had enemies everywhere. Enemies who had threatened his children, manipulated his family, attacked Newman Enterprises, and held grudges spanning generations. If Lily disappeared or if Dominic vanished, Devon's first instinct would be to assume that Victor had orchestrated the event as leverage or retaliation. And Devon, fueled by grief and fear, would confront Victor head-on. Abby, caught between her husband and her father, would become emotionally torn, forced to choose between protecting Victor or defending Devon. Their marriage, once stable, would fracture under the weight of suspicion. The emotional dominoes would be devastatingly precise: Abby defending Victor, Devon feeling betrayed, Victor refusing to justify himself, Devon spiraling into rage, Abby retreating into family loyalty, potential separation forming between them. And through it all, Tucker McCall would watch, waiting for a moment to exploit the chaos for his own benefit. Tucker had always been drawn to Devon in a twisted, complicated way, part genuine paternal love, part selfish desire for connection, part obsession with legacy. A crisis like this would be the perfect opportunity for Tucker to worm his way back into Devon's emotional orbit, offering support, promising help, feeding Devon's paranoia about Victor. And Tucker wasn't the only one who stood to gain. Audra Charles, calculating, ambitious, sharp as glass, might use the kidnapping to manipulate Nate, Daniel, or even Devin himself. Everyone in Genoa City had something to gain from someone vanishing. Meanwhile, the Mariah-Tessa-Daniel triangle would implode spectacularly. Mariah's instability would scare Tessa, who had always been patient but was now realizing the extent of Mariah's dependency. Daniel, already in an emotionally vulnerable place after Heather and Lucy drifted away, would become an unexpected confidant for Tessa, creating more distance, misunderstanding, and jealousy. If Dominic disappeared, and Mariah was suspected even briefly, it would break Tessa's heart and tear their marriage apart. Mariah would become the town pariah again, facing judgment, doubt, and emotional collapse. This would pull Daniel into the center of their marriage crisis, intensifying the triangle Brighton hinted would become a problem. And if Mariah was innocent but looked guilty, or if someone framed her, the psychological fallout would be massive. The tragedy of the potential kidnapping storyline was that every suspect had a motive, every family had a weakness, every character carried a psychological wound that could be exploited. The writers had crafted the perfect emotional storm. Mariah. Fragile, unstable, trauma-bonded to Dominic. Kane, vengeful, angry, tangled in criminal tension. Tucker, manipulative, opportunistic, morally flexible. Victor, surrounded by enemies, vulnerable through his grandchildren. Abby, torn between loyalty and fear. Devin, protective to the point of violence. Lily, the perfect target with a planned exit. Dominic, the symbolic heart of multiple families. If someone disappeared, the blast radius would affect nearly every major storyline on the canvas. The kidnapping, whether of Lily, Dominic, or another Winters family member, would not simply be a mystery to solve. It would be a psychological detonator, unraveling relationships, exposing secrets, and forcing every character involved to confront their darkest fears. Devin's world was about to change. Abby's loyalties were about to be tested. Mariah's stability was about to crumble. Kane's revenge was about to backfire. And Victor Newman, whether guilty or innocent, was about to be dragged into a battle he could not control. Because when someone is kidnapped in Genoa City, no family escapes untouched.